Warhammer 40,000 is a popular franchise that has been around for decades, and that means that it's lost a few video games along the way. Games that are no longer sold anywhere, and are also not playable through, other means either. These are the Warhammer 40k video games that you will never play again. First things first, I did a very similar video about 2 years back that was about lost D&D video games. And from that experience, I've learned that I need to take a second to define what exactly I mean when I say lost games. Being that Warhammer 40,000 is such a beloved franchise, most games that have stopped being sold have been tirelessly archived by fans. And they're still available if you know where to look, which I am legally obligated to tell you that is not a thing you should do. This, however, is a list of games that you will not be finding on abandonware sites. So how does this come to pass? How does Warhammer 40,000 lose so many games? Well, it's like this. Games preservation has become a lot harder these days, compared to what it used to be. Complicated protection software, hidden files, mandatory online server connections. The days are gone when if you just had the game file, you could share it around. Now you have to connect to servers, and if those don't exist, someone has to find a way to replicate that. And then they have to maintain it. Additionally, a lot of the games we're talking about are delisted mobile games, and there's not quite the same culture around preserving those titles compared to on other platforms. The older the 40k game, believe it or not, the more likely it is to be safely preserved for all time. Most of the games we're talking about today are actually quite recent. Matter of fact, I wanted to make this video about 2 years ago, right after I did the D&D list, but there weren't enough lost titles at that time. But now, there's almost too many to put into one video. Friends, Warhammer 40,000 is producing lost gaming media at an alarming rate. So let this be a warning to take good care of your favorites before they disappear forever. Hey everybody, I'm William SRD. I cover the video game adaptations of tabletop franchises. I try to teach you about the tabletop game, and then we cover the adaptations to see how it stacks up. If you want to support my channel and help me create videos about obscure games and tabletop franchises, please drop a like. I can at least get most of these things archived in video form. Also, it'd be a big help if you guys could like the video and sound off in the comments with which games in this list you have played. Or consider subscribing to my Patreon. I've got a monthly podcast up there that you guys are gonna love. Otherwise, if you care about games preservation, maybe take a crack at it yourself if you've got the skills, or the passion to learn them. Now, let's get into this list. And remember that I can't play these games either, so I'm going to link all the sources of where I got the gameplay footage down below. I'm piecing most of these games together from game reviews, let's plays, trailers, Reddit threads, and sometimes even patch notes. There are going to be times when I don't have the full story. If you actually played these games and you want to offer any corrections, please drop them in the comments. Eisenhorn Xenos was the second video game I ever covered on this channel, and even then it was getting a bit hard to get a hold of. It had already been delisted from Steam when I bought it. I had to get an old Steam code via Humble Bundle, which is no longer an option. Released in 2016 by Pixel Hero Games, this was a gamified action-adventure version of the first Eisenhorn novel by Dan Abnett. Although not the most popular 40k book of all time, the Eisenhorn trilogy may actually be the widest spread 40k novel, with many non-40k fans enjoying the series immensely. Eisenhorn the video game started its life as an iOS title, before being later ported over to the PC. The PC game fortunately doesn't feel too much like a mobile port at all. It's not a good game, to be abundantly clear, but the failure didn't lie with the quality of the port. They added a ton of visual effects options especially to play with in order to really make things pop. The game, unfortunately, was kind of just a big slog. It also butchered the plot in a lot of places that were very unforgivable. It let the book down in almost every way. Save for one. Eisenhorn is incredible. He looks like he's a full tech generation ahead of everyone else in the game. He's animated incredibly, modeled to perfection, and he's voiced by Mark Strong, who gives a jaw-dropping performance.
Do you think me weak? Flawed? To set my duty before her suffering? I would gladly ignore one life in agony if I could save 100, 1,000 more. For I have the moral strength required of an Inquisitor. Mankind must suffer, so that mankind can survive.
You're playing a really, really good Eisenhorn in a really, really bad version of the Eisenhorn story. It's a very weird feeling. Eisenhorn Xenos was removed from stores sometime in 2019 due to the studio's license running out. Games are harder to archive than they used to be, and since nobody really liked this game, no one's put in the work to make it playable. Warhammer 40k Legacy of Dorn, Herald of Oblivion is a digital gamebook with branching choices released for both Windows and iOS by Tin Man Games. And oh, fuck, that actually sounds sick. Damn Games Workshop for losing this game, to be quite honest. I am the exact target audience for a Warhammer 40k Choose Your Own Adventure book. I sure wish I knew about this game in 2015 when it came out. You play as one single Imperial Fist Terminator Marine, lost and wandering a space hulk called the Herald of Oblivion. The game choices were apparently vast, the atmosphere was quite stifling and creepy, and it came with some really excellent artwork as well. It was like you were playing this game on a damned Pip-Boy. Unfortunately, I am hardly the only one who missed this title. It peaked with very few players, and largely failed to find an audience. The license ran out in 2020, and the studio was forced to remove their game from stores. Remember this going forward. Games companies pay Games Workshop to maintain their license. If the game doesn't sell well, they can't afford to keep paying for the rights, and the game will therefore get delisted. It's why the really popular games have mostly stayed on Steam for a decade or more. They can afford to keep paying the license, while the smaller games get pulled within a year or two. Despite not doing very well commercially, this game was well received by those that did know about it, and Tin Man Games states that it opened up a lot of doors for them, even getting them the rights to adapt the Warlock of Firetop Mountain, one of the all-time most famous and influential choose-your-own-adventure modules. Horus Heresy, Drop Assault. Drop Assault was a strategy game for mobile devices, made by Complex Games and launched in 2015. In it, you take part in massive legion battles of the Horus Heresy. Specifically, it's the Istvan III atrocity, in which the War Master Horus attempted to purge his own warbands of Imperial loyalists. Meaning that this is kind of a weird one in terms of playable factions. All of the chapters you can play as are traitor legions, but you had the choice to play as, the true traitors or the chapter loyalists. Gameplay-wise, it's in that kind of Clash of Clans genre. You build a base, slowly collect resources, raid other teams, and etc, etc. There were hero units, artifacts, and everything else you would expect from a mobile game in this genre. No less, but also no more. Despite being a mobile game, it had a decent reputation with its player base. Mobile games are, of course, often of pretty low quality, and you're going to see a lot of examples of that on the list today. Yet, Drop Assault was often touted as one of the decent 40k mobile games, a little cut above the rest. Unfortunately, developer support clearly started flagging at a certain point, as they began focusing on other projects. The game went down in 2023 as the license ran out. The response was a bit of a whimper. The player base was small, but they were universally sad to see it go. This story has a weirdly happy ending though, because Complex Games was actually hard at work while their mobile game was languishing in semi-obscurity. They suddenly, all at once, left the mobile medium behind, surprising everyone with Chaos Gate Demon Hunters, a widely enjoyed squad strategy game for PC and consoles. One of the better 40k mobile games actually served as the stepping stone to create one of the better full 40k games. And that's kind of nice. It's also an example of why it's important to keep these games preserved. Whether they're good or not, they are part of the franchise history and the way that it evolves. Bad games can inspire good games, or otherwise they can affect the main franchise in tangible ways. Warhammer Carnage by Roadhouse Games. The next one is another mobile game, and yeah, you're gonna have to get used to that phrase, cause I am going to be saying it a lot. This one would soon be ported over to the PC under the name Carnage Champions for whatever reason. Releasing in 2014, Carnage was a side-scrolling shooter set on the war-torn planet of Mithra. You choose to play one of 3 different Space Marine chapters, and then you slowly clear a map of objectives to finish a story campaign. And there are 3 campaigns to choose from, one for each playable Space Marine chapter. More chapters were eventually added, and also the Adeptus Aeronaughtica. Hard to confirm exactly what all the releases were though, since there isn't much of a paper trail. Announcements were probably done in-game, and the community doesn't appear to have spent a lot of time online or elsewhere discussing these new releases. These new chapters and factions appear to have had their own full campaign as well, but I'm unable to confirm that. Now, one thing that you may notice about Carnage is, what the fuck? This is kinda sick though! Carnage's graphics were solid for what it was. The action was fast-paced, and the audio really stole the show. Reportedly, people liked how this game played, and the customization was satisfying. Unfortunately, that's where the game's merits end. The thing was notorious for its predatory monetization, as well as just how tedious it became after you'd played a few missions. Without any abilities beyond jump and shoot and move, there was just not a lot here, leaving you without any actual meat to sink your teeth into. The servers unexpectedly went down in 2017 and never came back up, leaving the player base to rage about paying for a game that had suddenly ceased to exist. There wasn't even anyone to vent their anger on, as Roadhouse Games took down their website and disappeared forever. In some ways, good riddance, but in other ways, oh damn, I gotta figure out where I can find that soundtrack. Deathwatch Tyranid Invasion is a mobile squad-based game, this time by Rodeo Games. This particular game isn't quite standalone. See, sometimes Warhammer games come in twos, a Warhammer fantasy game a la, say, Mordheim City of the Damned, and then a Warhammer 40k game in the same format, a la Necromunda Underhive Wars. In the case of Deathwatch Tyranid Invasion, its sister title is Warhammer Quest. Rodeo had made a pair of tactical mobile games called Hunters, and they decided to try taking that formula into the Warhammer universe. Warhammer Quest released in 2013. Fans found it to be quite likable, but also deeply flawed. By the time we got Deathwatch Tyranid Invasion in 2015, the formula had reportedly degraded into a bit of a cash grab. Nevertheless, it had its fans who were able to see past the muck and see what lay beneath. One reviewer titled it a budget 40k XCOM, which sure isn't a bad place to be. Plus, it still ended up standing head and shoulders over a lot of other mobile titles on this list. Here's a snippet from a dedicated fan explaining what makes it special.
And it's a mess of bad UI and bad game rules and things that aren't explained to us and things that you can't click on and frustrations, but beneath all of that, this is one of the best representations of Space Marines in any video game ever. It really is super satisfying to play, and the experience is so good. It makes Space Marines feel like Space Marines.
Deathwatch had a really rough launch, and the developers involved would be laid off very quickly after, when it became clear that the game wasn't selling like it needed to. The doors were kept open just long enough for a port to be released on Steam, and later on in the European PlayStation Store. The game would remain on all platforms on life support until 2021, when it disappeared forever. Warhammer Quest could have suffered a similar fate, but it's a more robust franchise, being connected to a classic board game. A new studio called Perchang picked it up and rescued Warhammer Quest. It's now available on GOG. Deathwatch, on the other hand, is just gone. Ah, Lost Crusade. The other mobile games we've covered have had some redeeming qualities. A decent game beneath the muck, or some solid vibes, or just being genuinely decent. Lost Crusade is none of those things. It was a base-building gacha game where you play as a lost Space Marine commander trying to find his way back home. It has all the hallmarks of a terrible mobile game. A million different currencies, 30 systems, and upgrades to keep track of at once, time gating, random champion drops. When you think of the most irredeemable way to create a Warhammer mobile game, this is probably what you think of. My god, what a problem Lost Crusade is. If it has any redeeming factor, it's that the graphics are honestly pretty great. It visually looks like what you would want from a Warhammer mobile game. It came out in 2021, and it disappeared from stores very suddenly in February 2024, making it one of the more blink and you'll miss it entries on this list. The developer, Orca Games, has gone dark, and no longer appears to have a website. Poking around the internet, you'll find most of the other mobile games had plenty of mourners who wish they could still access the game. The shutdown of Lost Crusade, however, was met with a resounding chorus of gamers cheering, "Rest in piss, you will not be missed." And listen, I'm a believer in preserving all games, purely for franchise history reasons. But if any game on this list deserves to stay lost, it's the Lost Crusade. Storm of Vengeance is a 2014 mobile and Steam game by Titanicus, a surprisingly long-lived British games company that traces its origins back to the 80s when they were called Zeppelin Games. The company was made famous in 2013 when they went all in on an open-world gaming project that was to finally make the studio's star ascend. It was called Ride to Hell Retribution, and it is widely considered to be one of the worst video games of all time. Warhammer 40k Storm of Vengeance was the broken studio's attempt to pull itself back up from bankruptcy after a historic failure. A licensed game that was cheap to produce? Well, that actually sounded like exactly what the studio needed to pull itself back up from its death spiral. But it was not to be. Storm of Vengeance was a flop, and the studio was forced to further downsize in the aftermath. They made another failed NASCAR game, and then shut their doors for good, after 30 years of game development. Storm of Vengeance itself is a lane-based RTS game based very loosely on an old Warhammer campaign book by the same name. I'm not against this game in theory. It does look like a satisfying mini-game. If this was a flash game made by a single guy on Newgrounds in 2007, I think we'd all have fond memories of it. Likewise, if this was a mini-game that you could do in a larger Warhammer 40k game, that would work too. Sounds nice even. But this game was not that. It cost around $5 to $8 depending on your platform and region. The game is just too small to play for more than a single half-hour session without getting bored. It's too simple to keep you engaged, and it was widely panned for being a shallow experience that was just a reskin of one of Titanicus's other games. The studio collapsed not long after the game's release. After the studio's collapse, Storm of Vengeance was removed from stores in 2016, never to be seen again. Talisman is a classic Games Workshop board game from the 80s. It actually predates Warhammer 40k by about 4 years. It's a fantasy-themed board game in which players race across the map to reach the Valley of Fire at the center. It's had a lot of additions over the years, and eventually publishing rights were licensed out to Fantasy Flight Games, followed by Pegasus Spiele about 5 years ago. It's had 1 million expansions, reskins, and new additions over the 40 years of its existence, including more than one video game. In 2013, Fantasy Flight Games, who were also producing the Warhammer role-playing games at the time, tripled down on their Games Workshop partnership by creating a board game called Relic, which was a Warhammer 40k themed Talisman board game. In 2016, a digital board game was also produced, further reskinning Relic and Talisman to instead be about the Horus Heresy. Being a board game adaptation, there's not a lot to say about this title. The two sides compete, not to reach the Valley of Fire, but instead to reach Holy Terra, where they will square off against either the Emperor or War Master Horus. The game was competently produced and received good reviews. It was everything you wanted if you enjoyed Talisman or Relic. The Fantasy Flight / Games Workshop partnership would eventually sour when Fantasy Flight began producing a Star Wars themed war game. Games Workshop broke things off after feeling that FFG had become a competitor instead of a partner. In 2020, the license ran out for the digital board game, and with FFG no longer involved, it was not to be renewed. Eternal Crusade is one of the biggest titles on this list, and it's also kind of breaking my own rules. I'm including it for a reason, and we'll get to that reason soon. For now, let's start with this. Eternal Crusade was a PvP shooter from 2016, set on the war-torn planet called Arcana. It calls itself an MMO, but in that way where every goddamn thing with multiplayer claims to be an MMO, mostly for marketing reasons. In this case, they did mean massive by shooter standards. A small match in this game is fought between 30+ players duking it out for control of the map. Players got to choose between Space Marines, Chaos Marines, Orcs, and Eldar for their games, with numerous character classes for each faction. This is definitely a cool project, and when you hear about this game, you'd think that sounds sick actually. Unfortunately, the game didn't really live up to its concept very well. It was janky at best, glitchy at worst. The game got a handful of patches before falling to the wayside, with the developers' much more successful game, Dead by Daylight, soon drawing most of the team's focus. Servers for Eternal Crusade went down in 2020, and the game spent years as lost media. And this is the part that probably disqualifies this from the list, but it's here anyway. Fans saved this game. It's back now, as of only a few months ago actually, thanks to a project called Eternal Crusade Resurrection. It's now peer-to-peer, thus meaning it no longer requires an external server to stay online. So long as people are still willing to play it, the Crusade shall remain eternal. I have chosen to include this game as part of this list, even though it isn't really lost, because I wanted to show you all that if you don't want the games on this list to stay lost, you have the power to save them. The Betrayal at Calth is one of the most iconic battles in the Horus Heresy, and it received a board game based on it in 2015, followed by a video game in 2020. It was created by Steel Wool Studios, best known for making the Five Nights at Freddy's VR game. Betrayal at Calth is a bit bizarre in concept. It's another XCOM-like game, except you control squads instead of individual units. That's all well and good, except, well, I don't know how to tell you this, but it was a VR game for some reason. You can play it on the PC, but all of the controls are clearly meant for VR. Based on what few reviews I've found, the gameplay is described as fine at best, and further held back by just how insanely weird it is to control a strategy game with a VR layout. This game seems to have been in an extremely unfinished state when the devs abandoned it. It's not much to look at visually by PC standards, but it actually looks pretty decent compared to other VR titles, I must say. Betrayal at Calth was removed from Steam so unceremoniously and without fanfare that I actually can't even figure out when exactly it happened. None of the Steam delisted websites have a record of this game, and the devs have scrubbed all mention of it from their website. Steam commenters talk about it not being for sale as early as mid-2021. Which means that whenever it went down, it sure wasn't online for long. The raw files of this game appear to be posted on the internet, but as of yet, it doesn't look like anyone's bothered to turn those raw files into a playable, actionable version. Adeptus Titanicus Dominus was a game that a lot of people wanted to succeed. Basically, a Battletech style game centered around the Imperial Titan legions. Fantastic idea. It's just one of those great game concepts that people have been waiting for. Thus, this game began early access in 2018, before getting a full release in 2021. The game was reportedly a pretty straight adaptation of the tabletop rules. Part of why the game did so poorly overall was the fact that early access was rough, and everybody could tell. Big YouTubers like Chapter Master Valrak covered it, and tens of thousands of Warhammer fans wrote the game off. It played bad, and it looked worse. The full release improved things by a lot. It was still rough to be sure, but it was much improved. Lots of the junk had been polished out, and the game's graphics were substantially upgraded. Plus it came with these cool comic book animatic sequences, and the art in those is gorgeous. Unfortunately, a combination of bad will from early access, plus having an extremely unwieldy name, meant that Warhammer 40,000 Adeptus Titanicus Dominus launched to only the most minuscule of audience. It peaked after launch with only 80 concurrent players. The studio shut down, and Dominus disappeared forever. A tragedy, considering how much improved it was, and how unique it is in the Warhammer catalog. To the Titan Legion fanatics out there, I guess you still have the Freeblade mobile game? Or maybe you should just get into Battletech. You're already into giant robot battling war games, just admit it, you're inevitably going to give in and play Battletech one day, so like what are you waiting for? There's even lots of video games, I'll cover them one day. It sucks to lose Aeronaughtica Imperialis. Aeronaughtica Imperialis Flight Command is one of those games you can tell people about and they'll go, "Sorry, did you say Warhammer 40k had a dog-fighting game?" And indeed we did. It came out in 2020 by an unknown studio called Binary Planets. It featured Imperial squadrons facing off against Orcish fighter jets above a massive WoG invasion. You could play as either one of those over a story campaign, but for some reason you reportedly could only play as the Imperials for the randomized skirmish campaign. They may have added Orcish skirmish campaigns post-launch or sometime in pre-development, but if they did, I couldn't find any record of it in the patch notes. This video game was based off of the miniature wargame Aeronaughtica Imperialis, which originated in 2007 and was relaunched in 2019. It has unfortunately often taken a backseat to Battlefleet Gothic, the flashier game about battling the gigantic voidcraft of the 41st millennium. And this dynamic has been generally true of their video games too. Flying war cathedrals are just innately captivating. Look at the player count disparity here. Nevertheless, Aeronaughtica Imperialis Flight Command had a strong sense of identity, tying itself to a very World War II aesthetic, as though Winston Churchill was telling the British people on the radio that we will fight the Orcish WoG on the beaches and in the skies. Controls were a bit strange here, but they certainly got the job done admirably. 3D combat is always a struggle. But in this case, you're just choosing where you want your craft to end up, and then you are separately choosing the elevation. There's also some crazy maneuvers you can choose from and flips that you can pull off, all of it in order to get your dogfighters where they need to be. It was remarkably simple of a control scheme, yet the game nonetheless had a reputation for its high difficulty. You had to know the tactics of finding the right way to move your planes, you see. It wasn't enough to just know the controls. It was a turn-based game, and when both sides had chosen where to go, the game would animate as they followed their paths and let loose their arsenals upon one another. I consider this to be a pretty clever way to run a game like this, but by all accounts the controls were just not quite tight enough and the animations weren't quite flash enough. The game failed to retain a user base, and it stopped receiving updates after its first year. And in 2023 it was announced that the license had run out. And that is our list. 11 Warhammer games that are currently positioned as lost media, plus one that was only recently saved. But more of these games can be saved too. I'm not going to tell you that all of these games deserve preservation, but you know what? Warhammer 40,000 is. And we are rapidly losing the recent video game history of the franchise. Let me tell you, it's going to be a lot easier to archive this stuff today than it will be in 2030.
If you think I missed any game, please let me know down in the comments below. At the rate we're currently losing 40k games, I already expect that I'm going to be making a follow-up list next year. Also, it's been quite a while since I've done a full playtest as a stream. I'm going to be reviewing Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance soon, and I want to take you guys along the road with me. Use the link down in the description below to join me in the Discord, and you'll find the stream schedule as soon as it's posted.